The unexpected roadblock. Derek Malone adjusted the rearview mirror of his aging sedan as he drove along the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, a small town that he called home. The soft hum of the car's engine filled the silence, punctuated occasionally by the faint rattle of a loose dashboard piece. It had been a long day at the distribution warehouse where he worked, but his spirits remained high. Tomorrow was his son Jaden's 10th birthday, and tucked securely in the glove compartment was a box containing a brand-new digital watch, the one Jaden had been saving up for but couldn't quite afford. The anticipation of seeing his son's face light up was enough to make the exhaustion melt away. The streets were mostly empty, bathed in the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. Derek's thoughts drifted to the weekend, to the family barbecue they'd planned at the park, and to the pride he felt in creating memories Jaden would cherish. As Derek turned onto Maplewood Avenue, his peaceful drive was abruptly interrupted by flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The blare of a siren cut through the evening calm, and his heart sank. He quickly checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His seatbelt was fastened, and his registration was up to date. There was no reason for him to be pulled over, but the anxiety in his chest didn't care about logic. He eased his car to the curb, put it in park, and turned off the engine. As he rolled down his window, Derek's hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, visible and steady. Years of lessons from his parents about how to handle situations like these replayed in his mind. Stay calm. Be respectful. Don't make sudden movements. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to appear composed. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer approached the car. His uniform was crisp, his hand resting on his belt, dangerously close to his holstered firearm. He peered into Derek's car, his expression unreadable, but his posture brimming with authority. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "Yes, sir," Derek replied evenly, retrieving the requested documents from the glove compartment. He handed them over, his movements measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer glanced at the documents, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where are you headed?" "Home," Derek answered, keeping his voice steady. "I just picked up a birthday gift for my son." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Derek as if sizing him up, his gaze lingering uncomfortably long. Then, as if coming to a decision, he gestured sharply. "Step out of the vehicle." Derek's stomach dropped. "May I ask why, officer?" The officer's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice harder this time. Derek hesitated but knew better than to argue. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk, his hands remaining visible. The officer motioned for him to stand by the curb while he began inspecting the car, flashlight in hand. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and cracked open doors, their shadows flickering as they whispered amongst themselves. A small group began to gather a few feet away, murmuring with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Derek could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their silent judgment pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Derek asked, keeping his tone polite but firm. The officer straightened, his flashlight still pointed inside the car. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said flatly. "You fit the description." Derek's jaw tightened. He'd heard this line before, not directed at him, but at others who shared his skin color. It was a phrase that seemed to carry no meaning yet always led to humiliation. He took a deep breath, determined not to let his frustration show. "I live 10 minutes from here," he said. "My license has my address. I've done nothing wrong." The officer ignored him, leaning into the car and opening the glove compartment. He pulled out the small, neatly wrapped box that Derek had carefully placed there just hours earlier. Tearing off the wrapping paper, he inspected the watch as though it might be contraband. "What is this?" the officer demanded, holding up the watch. "It's a gift for my son," Derek replied, his voice sharper now. "Please, put it back." The officer smirked, tossing the watch carelessly back onto the passenger seat. "Looks expensive," he said, as if implying Derek had no business owning it. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their unease turning into audible disapproval. A young woman holding her phone to record the scene called out, "What's he even doing? He hasn't done anything wrong." The officer turned to the crowd, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice loud and commanding. But the crowd didn't disperse. If anything, they seemed emboldened, their expressions shifting from confusion to quiet defiance. Derek stood silently, his fists clenched at his sides. The officer's actions were a blatant display of power, a humiliation meant to remind Derek of his place. But as the seconds ticked by, Derek realized that this moment was no longer just about him. The gathering crowd, their phones recording every movement, was a testament to a shared frustration, a refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice. The officer turned back to Derek, his expression hard. "You're free to go," he said abruptly, tossing Derek's license and registration onto the hood of the car. He didn't offer an apology or an explanation, just a curt nod before walking back to his patrol car. Derek exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He retrieved his documents and the discarded watch, placing them back into the glove compartment. The crowd erupted into scattered applause and shouts of support, their voices a balm for the wounds left by the officer's actions. As Derek climbed back into his car, he noticed a woman stepping forward from the crowd. She was middle-aged, dressed casually, with a determined look in her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "I'm Mrs. Langston, a teacher at the local elementary school. I know you're a good man, and I'm not letting this go." Her words hung in the air, a promise of solidarity and action. Derek nodded, gratitude filling his chest as he started the car. As he drove away, the weight of the incident lingered, but so did the unexpected support from the community. What had begun as a quiet drive home had turned into a public ordeal, one that would ripple far beyond that night. Derek didn't yet know how, but he sensed that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. A ripple of voices. The next morning, Derek sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on his mind. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside did little to quell the restless buzz of his thoughts. Across the table, his son Jaden eagerly tore through the wrapping paper of his birthday gift, his face lighting up as he pulled out the digital watch. "Wow, Dad, this is awesome," Jaden exclaimed, his small fingers fumbling to strap the watch onto his wrist. Derek managed to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He ruffled Jaden's curly hair. "I'm glad you like it, buddy," he said, his voice tinged with weariness. Jaden glanced up, his youthful excitement giving way to curiosity. "Are you okay, Dad? You look sad." Derek hesitated. How could he explain to his 10-year-old son the complex mix of anger, humiliation, and exhaustion he felt? Instead, he leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I'm just tired, Jay. Grown-up stuff. But don't worry about me, okay? Today it is all about you." Jaden beamed and nodded, already absorbed in exploring the features of his new watch. Derek's heart ached with the desire to shield his son from the realities of the world for just a little longer. Later that day, Derek's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Videos of the traffic stop had made their way to social media. He hesitated before clicking on one of the clips. The shaky footage showed every humiliating detail of the interaction, the officer rummaging through his car, tossing the gift aside, and finally retreating under the watchful eyes of a growing crowd. The caption read, "Harassment in Cedar Grove. Man stopped for looking suspicious. This has to stop." The comments were a mixture of outrage, support, and ignorance. Some users applauded Derek's composure, calling him a symbol of resilience, while others dismissed the incident as routine or even justified. Derek sighed, placing the phone face down on the table. The public attention felt both validating and suffocating. He didn't want to be a symbol or a rallying cry. He just wanted to live his life in peace. That evening, a knock at the door startled Derek out of his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Langston, the teacher who had stood up for him during the traffic stop, standing there with a clipboard in hand. She looked determined, her presence radiating calm authority. "Hi, Derek," she began, offering a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to check on you and see how you're holding up." Derek stepped aside to let her in. "Thanks, Mrs. Langston. It's been a lot," he admitted. "I appreciate what you did last night. You didn't have to step in like that." Mrs. Langston set the clipboard on the counter and folded her arms. "It was the right thing to do. And call me Linda, please. We're neighbors, after all." Derek nodded, a small smile breaking through. "All right, Linda. So, what brings you here?" Linda gestured to the clipboard. "I've been talking to some folks around the neighborhood. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. Too many people have similar stories, and it's time we do something about it. I'm organizing a community meeting this weekend to talk about police accountability and how we can support each other." Derek's first instinct was to decline. He wasn't sure he had the energy to relive the experience, let alone speak about it in front of a group. But as he looked at Linda, her resolve unwavering, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there." The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of activity. Flyers appeared on telephone poles, social media posts spread the word, and conversations buzzed on the streets of Cedar Grove. Derek found himself fielding calls and messages from neighbors he barely knew, all offering their support or sharing their own stories of injustice. When Saturday arrived, the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, and more people stood along the walls, murmuring to each other. Derek felt a pang of nervousness as he walked in, but Linda greeted him with a reassuring smile. "Derek," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm glad you're here. You're not alone in this." The meeting began with Linda addressing the crowd, her voice clear and commanding. She spoke about the importance of unity, the power of collective action, and the need to hold institutions accountable. "We're here today because one of our own was treated unfairly," she said, gesturing toward Derek. "But this isn't just about Derek. It's about all of us. It's about making sure no one in our community feels powerless or afraid." The room erupted in applause, and Derek felt a lump form in his throat. Linda then invited others to share their experiences. One by one, people stood up, their voices steady but emotional. A young woman recounted being followed home late at night by a police car for no reason. An older man described being stopped repeatedly while jogging in his own neighborhood. Each story added to the collective outrage and determination in the room. When it was Derek's turn to speak, he stood hesitantly, the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Last week, I was driving home after a long day at work," he said. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws, but I was stopped because I'd looked suspicious. I've always tried to teach my son to respect the law, but how do I explain to him that the law doesn't always respect us?" His words hung in the air, the silence in the room almost deafening. Then, slowly, the crowd began to clap, their applause growing into a standing ovation. Derek sat down, overwhelmed but grateful for the support surrounding him. By the end of the meeting, the community had developed a plan. They would push for mandatory bias training for local police officers, demand transparency in investigations, and establish a neighborhood watch program, not to police each other, but to protect and support one another. As people filed out of the center, Derek felt a renewed sense of hope. Linda approached him, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Change takes time, but it starts with moments like this." Derek nodded, his resolve strengthening. For the first time in days, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. Together, They would push for a better future, not just for him and Jaden, but for everyone in Cedar Grove. The sparks of change. The weeks following the community meeting brought a flurry of activity to Cedar Grove. Derek had initially hoped to step back, let the moment pass, and return to his life of quiet routines. But the community, galvanized by Linda's leadership and the raw stories shared that day, had other plans. They weren't going to let the momentum slip away. Neither, it seemed, was Derek. One brisk Friday morning, Derek found himself at Linda's dining room table. Her home was modest but brimming with life. Bookshelves lined the walls, family photos adorned every corner, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. A whiteboard leaned precariously against the wall, covered in scribbles of ideas, meeting times, and action items. "We need to be strategic," Linda said, tapping her pen against a legal pad. "If we're going to push for bias training, we have to get the city council involved. And that means showing them this isn't just a handful of people complaining. It's the entire community demanding change." Derek nodded, sipping his coffee. He still wasn't sure how he'd gone from the reluctant centerpiece of a viral incident to an active participant in the fight for reform. But as he listened to Linda speak, her passion and clarity ignited something within him. He thought of Jaden, of the world he wanted his son to grow up in. And he knew he couldn't sit on the sidelines. "So what's the first step?" Derek asked, leaning forward. Linda's eyes lit up. "Petitions, public forums, and media attention. We need signatures, stories, and visibility. The more people we have on our side, the harder it'll be for them to ignore us." The petition was the first to take shape. Over the next few days, volunteers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and explaining their cause. Derek joined them, initially unsure of how people would react. To his surprise, most residents were supportive. Many had seen the video and were eager to help. At one house, an elderly woman opened the door and peered out cautiously. Derek introduced himself, explaining the petition and the group's goals. "I saw what happened to you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It reminded me of what my husband used to go through years ago. I thought things had changed, but maybe they haven't." She signed the petition with a flourish and handed it back with a firm nod. "You make sure they hear you." Derek left that house with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had endured similar experiences, every parent who worried for their children, and every voice that had been silenced. Meanwhile, Linda worked tirelessly to secure a venue for their first public forum. The community center, already a hub of activity, agreed to host it. Flyers went up around town, social media posts spread the word, and local radio stations picked up the story. The night of the forum, the center was packed once again. Derek stood at the back of the room, watching as people filtered in. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anticipation and determination. This time, the attendees weren't just neighbors. They were teachers, local business owners, church leaders, and even a few city officials who had come to listen. Linda took the stage first, her voice clear and confident. She laid out their goals: improved training for officers, a more transparent complaint process, and better community relations. Then, one by one, speakers came forward to share their stories. A young man recounted how he'd been stopped and searched while walking to work, his only crime being that he fit a vague description. A mother spoke tearfully about her teenage son, who had been arrested for loitering while waiting for a friend outside a convenience store. Each story painted a vivid picture of a systemic problem, one that couldn't be ignored. When it was Derek's turn, he felt a wave of nervousness. He hadn't planned to speak, but the weight of the moment pushed him forward. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. "Most of you know me as the guy in that video," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "But I'm more than that. I'm a father, a worker, a neighbor. And what happened to me that night, it shouldn't happen to anyone." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I didn't ask for this spotlight, but now that it's here, I can't turn away from it. Because if we don't stand up, nothing will change. And I want to believe that this town, our town, can be better." The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that left Derek both humbled and inspired. As he stepped down, Linda met him with a proud smile. "You've got a gift, Derek," she said. "People listen to you. Use that." In the days that followed, the petition reached its goal of 2,000 signatures, enough to present to the city council. Derek and Linda, along with a small group of volunteers, prepared for the meeting with meticulous care. They rehearsed their speeches, gathered data, and ensured that every signature and story was accounted for. The city council meeting was held in the grand hall of the municipal building. It was an intimidating space, with its high ceilings and rows of polished wood benches. Derek felt a pang of doubt as he walked in, but the sight of familiar faces in the crowd gave him strength. Linda led the charge, presenting their case with eloquence and precision. She spoke of the community's concerns, the incidents that had sparked their movement, and the solutions they were proposing. Derek followed, his voice steady and heartfelt as he shared his story once more. By the time they finished, the council members looked visibly moved. The room erupted in applause as Derek and Linda took their seats, the support from the audience undeniable. The council agreed to review their proposals and promised to hold further discussions. It wasn't a definitive victory, but it was a step forward, a crack in the wall of resistance. As Derek left the meeting, he felt a mix of relief and determination. This was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there would be setbacks, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Outside the municipal building, Linda turned to him. "We did good today, Derek," she said, "but we've got a lot more work to do." Derek nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. The weight of resistance, the initial progress made by Derek and the Cedar Grove community ignited a sense of optimism that rippled through their town. However, as the days turned into weeks, the challenges became more evident. Not everyone was supportive of their cause. While many applauded their efforts, there were those who resented the push for change. Resistance came in subtle, and sometimes overt, ways that threatened to stall their movement. It started with whispers in local circles. Comments like, "Why stir up trouble when everything was fine?" and "Not all cops are bad," echoed in online forums and at local coffee shops. Derek became a frequent topic of discussion, his face now associated with the community's call for reform. Some hailed him as a hero, while others painted him as a troublemaker. The backlash wasn't just talk. Flyers promoting their next forum were torn down almost as soon as they were put up. An anonymous letter appeared in Linda's mailbox, warning her to stop causing problems if she valued her reputation. Even Derek began noticing a shift. At the factory where he worked, some colleagues were less friendly, their smiles replaced with cold stares or awkward silences. One afternoon, as Derek walked to his car after his shift, he found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. The handwriting was crude, the message clear. "We don't need agitators. Back off." Derek clenched the note in his hand, his chest tightening with anger and fear. He glanced around the parking lot, but it was empty except for a few cars in the distance. Shaking his head, he crumpled the paper and tossed it into his car. He had expected resistance, but the personal nature of the threats made it harder to bear. At their next community meeting, Derek shared the incident with Linda and a few close supporters. The small group gathered in Linda's living room, the atmosphere heavy with concern. "This is what happens when people feel threatened by change," Linda said, her voice calm but firm. "It's a tactic to scare us into silence." "I'm not scared," Derek said, though his clenched fists betrayed his frustration. "But I can't lie. It's exhausting. I didn't sign up for this to become a target." A man in the group, David, nodded in agreement. "They want to wear us down. That's how they win. But we can't let them." Linda placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. You're not in this alone. We've come too far to turn back now." The group discussed strategies to counteract the backlash. They decided to document every threat and report them to the authorities. They also planned to double down on outreach, ensuring that their message wasn't drowned out by negativity. As the weeks went on, the resistance grew more coordinated. During a neighborhood watch meeting, a few participants openly challenged the group's motives. "This whole thing is making the town look bad," one man said, crossing his arms. "We don't have a problem here." That incident with Derek was blown out of proportion. Linda, ever composed, addressed him directly. "With all due respect, if you believe there's no problem, it's because you've never experienced it. This isn't just about one incident. It's about ensuring everyone feels safe and respected in our community." Derek stood up, his voice steady. "No one's trying to make the town look bad. We're trying to make it better. If standing up for fairness makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's time we ask ourselves why." The room fell silent, the weight of Derek's words settling over the group. Though a few attendees left early, others stayed behind, eager to learn more about the group's goals. The turning point came one Saturday morning when Derek received a call from Linda. "You need to come to the community center," she said, her voice urgent. Derek arrived to find Linda and several volunteers staring at a spray-painted message on the side of the building. The bright red letters read, "Stay in your lane or else." The sight made Derek's stomach churn. This wasn't just resistance. It was a direct threat. Police officers arrived to document the vandalism, but their reaction was tepid, brushing it off as kids causing trouble. Linda shook her head in frustration. "This isn't kids. This is someone trying to intimidate us." Derek felt a surge of anger. "So what do we do? Let them scare us into quitting?" Linda turned to face him, her expression resolute. "We do what we've been doing. Stand together, louder and stronger than before." The incident galvanized the group. They organized a peaceful rally in response, inviting residents to stand in solidarity against hate and intimidation. The rally drew a larger crowd than expected, with families, teachers, business owners, and even local faith leaders showing up to support the cause. Derek took the stage, his voice filled with both determination and vulnerability. "I've been called many things these past few weeks. A troublemaker, a rabble-rouser, even a liar. But the truth is, I'm just a father trying to make this town safer for my son. And I know I'm not the only one who wants that." The crowd erupted in applause. Chants of "enough is enough" echoing through the air. Local news outlets covered the rally, further amplifying their message. In the days following the rally, the tide began to shift. More people reached out, offering their support. Small businesses displayed signs in their windows that read, "We stand with Cedar Grove's future." Churches hosted discussions about equality and inclusion. The City Council announced a formal review of the community's proposals, including the implementation of bias training for police officers. For Derek, the journey was far from over. The threats and resistance weighed heavily on him, but so did the overwhelming support he now felt from his community. Every message of encouragement, every handshake, and every shared story reminded him why he had stepped into this fight. One evening, as Derek tucked Jaden into bed, his son looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Dad," Jaden asked, "why do some people not like what you're doing?" Derek paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes people don't like change because it makes them face things they'd rather ignore. But standing up for what's right isn't always easy, Jay. It's worth it, though, especially when it's for people you love." Jaden smiled sleepily. "You're brave, Dad." Derek kissed his son's forehead and turned off the light, the words lingering in his heart. He didn't feel brave most of the time, but he knew that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when fear was present. As he sat in the quiet of his living room that night, Derek resolved to keep pushing forward. The weight of resistance was heavy, but so was the strength of a community determined to make a difference. Together, they would carry the weight, one step at a time. Fractures and fortitude. The Cedar Grove community was buzzing with both progress and tension. The rally had drawn significant attention, sparking hope among its organizers, but it also provoked stronger opposition. As Derek sat in his kitchen late one evening, sifting through emails and social media messages, the duality of support and resistance became clear. For every message of solidarity, there was one filled with vitriol. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at him. His phone buzzed with a new notification, a video message from Linda. Her face appeared on the screen, her expression resolute despite the weariness in her eyes. "Derek, I know it feels like the world is closing in on us sometimes," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, we're not just fighting against something. We're fighting for something better. Take a breath, recharge, and we'll keep moving forward. Together." He smiled faintly, the reminder cutting through the fog of discouragement. He replied with a simple, "Thanks, Linda. Let's keep going." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Derek and Linda's group, now officially called Voices of Cedar Grove, worked tirelessly to prepare for their next big step. A formal proposal to the city council. The document detailed their requests: mandatory bias training for police officers, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and transparency in complaint investigations. But cracks within the community began to emerge. While many supported the group's goals, others grew impatient, questioning whether they were moving fast enough or focusing on the right issues. Some wanted a more confrontational approach, while others felt the demands were too ambitious. At one meeting, tensions boiled over. The community center was packed, and the air buzzed with heated discussions. A man named Carl, a longtime resident, stood up, his face red with frustration. "This isn't working," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "We've been talking for weeks, and what do we have to show for it? A few signatures and some rallies. We need action." Linda, ever composed, addressed him. "Carl, I understand your frustration. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we're making progress. The council is listening." "They're listening because it's convenient for them," Carl interrupted. "What happens when it's not? What happens when they shut us down? We need to be prepared for that." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement. Derek stood, his hands raised to calm the room. "Look, I get it," he said. "We're all tired, and we all want results. But we need to stick together. If we fracture now, we're giving the opposition exactly what they want." The room quieted, but the tension lingered. After the meeting, Derek and Linda sat alone in the center, the echo of their earlier conversations hanging in the air. "Do you think we're losing them?" Derek asked, his voice heavy. Linda shook her head. "No, but we need to remind them why we started this. People need hope, Derek, and they need to see that what we're doing matters." The opportunity to prove their efforts mattered came sooner than expected. A local news station reached out, requesting an interview with Derek and Linda about the movement. Though hesitant, Derek agreed, recognizing the potential to amplify their message. The interview was filmed in the park where the first rally had taken place. The reporter, a young woman named Julia, asked pointed questions about the group's goals and challenges. "Derek, you've become the face of this movement. How does that responsibility feel?" she asked. Derek paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about all of us, neighbors, parents, workers, coming together to make Cedar Grove a place where everyone feels safe and respected. That responsibility isn't mine alone. It's shared." Julia nodded, turning to Linda. "And what do you say to those who believe this movement is unnecessary or disruptive?" Linda didn't miss a beat. "I'd ask them to listen. Listen to the stories, the pain, and the hope behind what we're doing. Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary." The segment aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Calls, emails, and messages poured in, some from local supporters, others from people in nearby towns who wanted to start similar initiatives. But the backlash also intensified. Online forums buzzed with anger, accusing Derek and Linda of stirring the pot and dividing the town. One evening, as Derek returned home, he noticed a police car parked a few houses down. The officer inside watched him intently as he pulled into his driveway. Derek's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He carried Jaden's soccer bag from the car and walked inside without looking back. Later that night, as he sat in the living room, a knock at the door startled him. Linda stood there, holding a stack of papers. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, stepping inside. "We got this today." She handed him the papers, copies of emails sent to the city council opposing their proposals. Derek scanned the pages, his jaw tightening. The emails accused voices of Cedar Grove of creating unnecessary tension and vilifying law enforcement. Some included thinly veiled threats. "They're trying to discredit us," Linda said, her voice steady but edged with concern. "We need to be ready for their next move." Derek nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we fight back, with facts, with stories, with people who believe in what we're doing." The group's next public forum was their largest yet. Held in the high school auditorium, it drew hundreds of attendees, including local media and city officials. Derek stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. "I've been asked a lot lately why we're doing this," he began. "Why we're pushing for change. The answer is simple: because it's the right thing to do. Because no one should feel unsafe in their own community. And because my son, your children, deserve a future where fairness and justice aren't just words, but realities." The applause was thunderous, and for the first time in weeks, Derek felt the weight of doubt lift slightly. As he stepped off the stage, Linda joined him, her smile reassuring. "We're getting there," she said. "Slowly, but we're getting there." Derek nodded, the spark of hope reigniting. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Together, they were stronger than any resistance, and their fight was far from over. A community transformed. Months had passed since Derek's quiet drive home had ignited a movement in Cedar Grove. The town was now unrecognizable, not because of any visible change to its streets or skyline, but because of the profound shift in its people. Conversations once confined to hushed whispers were now out in the open. The weight of unspoken truths, carried for generations, was finally being shared. Derek stood at the front of the Cedar Grove Community Center on a crisp autumn evening, addressing a room filled with familiar and unfamiliar faces. It was their first meeting as an official community advocacy group. After weeks of hard work and persistence, the City Council had approved their petition to create a civilian oversight board for the local police department. The news had sent ripples of hope through the town, but Derek knew this victory was only the beginning. He cleared his throat, the room quieting. "Tonight is a celebration," he began, his voice steady but warm. "We've come a long way, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. But let's be clear, there's still work to do." The crowd clapped, their enthusiasm filling the room. Linda, seated in the front row, gave him a reassuring nod. The trust and camaraderie they had built over the months were palpable. Derek's once hesitant steps into activism had become strides, guided by purpose and bolstered by a community that refused to stay silent. In the days following the City Council's decision, implementation of the Oversight Board began. It was a groundbreaking moment for Cedar Grove. The board, composed of elected community members, included individuals from diverse backgrounds: teachers, business owners, retirees, and even a local pastor. Derek and Linda were appointed as advisors, their voices instrumental in shaping the board's policies. The first task was reviewing complaints against the police department, starting with the officer involved in Derek's traffic stop. The Oversight Board was tasked with determining whether the officer's actions violated department policy and if disciplinary action was warranted. It was a delicate process, one that required transparency and impartiality. For Derek, it was both cathartic and challenging. He attended every meeting, determined to ensure that no one else would endure what he had. The process wasn't perfect. There were moments of frustration and heated debate, but progress was undeniable. The board's work shone a light on systemic issues that had long been ignored, forcing the police department to confront uncomfortable truths. As the oversight board gained momentum, the town began to heal in unexpected ways. Conversations about race, privilege, and justice became commonplace in schools, churches, and even local diners. Jaden's elementary school introduced a new curriculum focusing on diversity and inclusion, with Linda spearheading its development. The children's enthusiasm for learning about different cultures and perspectives was a stark contrast to the resistance their parents had once shown. At home, Derek noticed a change in Jaden. His son, once quiet and shy, now spoke confidently about fairness and kindness. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Jaden turned to him. "Dad," he said, his voice thoughtful, "when I grow up, I want to help people too, like you and Miss Linda." Derek smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Jay. Just remember, helping people isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Despite the progress, challenges remained. A small but vocal group in the town continued to oppose the changes, accusing Derek and Linda of dividing the community. Some businesses refused to support the movement, and the occasional hateful message still found its way to Derek's inbox. But these voices grew quieter as the tangible benefits of the movement became evident. One turning point came when the Cedar Grove Police Department announced a partnership with the Community Advocacy Group to host town halls and workshops. The first event, held at the high school gymnasium, drew a large crowd. Officers sat alongside residents, sharing their perspectives and listening to the stories of those they served. The dialogue wasn't always comfortable, but it was honest, a crucial step toward building trust. Derek sat on a panel that night, alongside Linda and the police chief, a stoic but receptive man named Captain Harris. The chief had initially resisted the changes, but as the town rallied behind the movement, he had no choice but to adapt. "We're here to rebuild relationships," Captain Harris said, addressing the crowd. "And that starts with accountability, on both sides. We're committed to listening and learning, and I hope you'll hold us to that commitment." Derek spoke next, his voice calm but firm. "Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about growth. It's about making sure we all do better, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation." The applause was deafening, the energy in the room electric. Months turned into a year, and Cedar Grove continued its transformation. The Oversight Board became a model for neighboring towns, inspiring similar initiatives across the county. Linda was invited to speak at statewide conferences about community advocacy, while Derek received invitations to share his story on panels and in interviews. For Derek, the attention was humbling but secondary to the changes he saw around him. Neighbors who had once been strangers now greeted each other warmly. Children played together in the park without the shadow of prejudice looming over them. And while the journey wasn't over, the progress was undeniable. One evening, Derek stood in his backyard, watching Jaden kick a soccer ball with his friends. Linda joined him, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Derek and smiled. "Can you believe how far we've come?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Derek nodded, his gaze on the children. "It's amazing, but there's still so much to do." Linda chuckled. "There always will be. But tonight, let's take a moment to appreciate what we've built." They stood in silence, the hum of cicadas and the laughter of children filling the air. For the first time in a long time, Derek felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been arduous, marked by pain and resilience, but it had been worth every step. The next morning, Derek woke to an email from a journalist who had been following Cedar Grove's story. The subject line read, "The Heart of a Movement." The article detailed the town's transformation, highlighting the courage of ordinary people who had come together to create extraordinary change. Derek read the article aloud to Jaden, who listened intently, his eyes wide with admiration. When Derek finished, Jaden grinned. "Dad, you're famous." Derek laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Not famous, buddy. Just part of something bigger." As Jaden ran off to play, Derek sat back and let the gravity of the moment sink in. He hadn't asked to become a symbol or a leader, but he had embraced it. The community of Cedar Grove had proven that change was possible when people stood together. And while the road ahead would still have challenges, Derek knew they had laid a foundation strong enough to weather them. Together, they had transformed a moment of injustice into a movement of hope, a testament to the power of unity, resilience, and the unwavering belief that a better future was worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, the impact of Cedar Grove's transformation began to ripple outward, reaching neighboring towns and even attracting national attention. News outlets covered the community's story, not as one of division, but as a beacon of hope for towns grappling with similar challenges. It became a narrative of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. Derek found himself increasingly in the spotlight. He was invited to speak at schools, conferences, and even state assemblies, sharing his journey from a quiet factory worker to a reluctant activist. But no matter where he went, he always came back to Cedar Grove, his home, his grounding force, and the community that had fueled the change. One evening, Derek sat with Linda in the now bustling Cedar Grove Community Center. The Oversight Board had just concluded its latest review session, and the mood in the room was lighter than it had been in months. Progress was evident, not just in the policies being implemented, but in the trust slowly being rebuilt between the police and the community. Linda leaned back in her chair, a rare moment of relaxation evident in her posture. "Do you realize how far we've come?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with pride. Derek smiled, nodding. "It's hard to believe sometimes. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this." Linda tilted her head. "And yet here we are. You've done more than just imagine it, Derek. You've lived it, and you've led it." Derek shook his head modestly. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. You, the board, the neighbors who stood up that night, and the people who never stopped believing we could be better." Linda raised her glass of water in a toast. "To Cedar Grove, a town that proves change is possible." Derek clinked his glass against hers, the sound a quiet affirmation of their shared victory. The real test of their efforts came during the annual Cedar Grove Festival, a cherished event that had been overshadowed in recent years by tension and declining attendance. This year, however, the festival was a symbol of unity. The once divided community came together in a way that felt both natural and monumental. Booths lined the park, showcasing local artisans, food vendors, and organizations, including a table for Voices of Cedar Grove. Children played freely, their laughter blending with the sound of live music. Police officers, many of whom had undergone bias training over the past months, mingled with residents, engaging in conversations that felt genuine. Derek walked through the park with Jaden, who darted excitedly from one booth to the next. As he passed familiar faces, he was met with smiles, handshakes, and words of gratitude. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Linda approached, her arms filled with flyers for the group's next event. "You know," she said, her eyes scanning the vibrant scene, "this is what it's all about. Building something that lasts." Derek nodded, his gaze following Jaden as he joined a group of kids playing tag. "Yeah, this is the future I wanted for him." That evening, as the festival wound down, Derek was asked to say a few words on stage. He hesitated for a moment, still unaccustomed to being the center of attention. But as he stepped onto the platform and looked out at the crowd, a mix of friends, neighbors, and strangers, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He gripped the microphone, his voice steady. "A little over a year ago, I found myself on this road, unsure of what would come next. What happened to me that night wasn't unique. It was part of something bigger, something that's been ignored for too long. But what happened after, that was special. That was a community coming together, standing up, and refusing to let fear or division win. He paused, scanning the crowd, his eyes meeting Jaden's bright, proud gaze. Cedar Grove isn't perfect, and it never will be. But what makes us strong is our willingness to try, to listen, to learn, and to grow together. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers carrying across the park. Derek stepped back, his heart full, as Linda joined him on stage. "We've got more work to do," she whispered with a smile. Derek nodded, his smile matching hers. "Always. But tonight, let's celebrate." As the festival lights dimmed and the park emptied, Derek and Jaden walked home under a sky filled with stars. Jaden, clutching a balloon animal he'd gotten at the festival, looked up at his father. "Dad," he said, his voice filled with curiosity, "do you think things will stay like this?" Derek stopped, kneeling to meet his son's eyes. "I hope so, Jay. But it's up to all of us to make sure it does. Change isn't something you do once. It's something you keep doing." Jaden nodded solemnly, his young mind already absorbing the lesson. "Then I'll help too." Derek smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "You already are." The journey of Cedar Grove wasn't over, and it never would be. But for the first time, the town wasn't defined by its struggles. It was defined by its resilience, its unity, and its unwavering belief in a better future. And as Derek looked out at the quiet streets of his hometown, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would always have its challenges, but he knew one thing for certain. Together, they would face them, stronger than ever.